So you did it. You landed a huge podcast guesting spot. This podcast is so big. It has your ideal client right in that audience. It has your ideal listener for your podcast right in that audience. And this is your chance. This is your big break. You do everything that the host asks of you. You choose the exact right date and time that is good for them. You cancel everything else for that day to prepare. They even send you the questions in advance and you study up for them. In fact, you type all the answers in case you forget anything. Anything that host wants, they will get from you. This is your opportunity. You are just honored to be there. Then you go to the interview. You think it went pretty well. It gets published. And then crickets. Nothing happens. You don't get new followers. You don't get new clients. It's like it came and went, and it's as if it had never happened. That is probably the most common experience of podcast guests. Podcast guesting is one of the most powerful ways to elevate your authority out there. And for some reason, most of us don't take full advantage of it. We think that just the opportunity itself is enough to get you to that next level. But very often, those big opportunities don't seem to pan out. In this talk, I want to make sure that's not what happens to you. I want you to walk out of that interview knowing that you are going to get clients, you are going to get followers, and your future is going to be determined by how this interview goes. And it has nothing to do with doing a better interview, with being more jovial, with being more likable. There's a little bit of that. That's not what this is about. In this talk, I want to give you 3 tips for what to do during the interview to make sure that this interview has legs and it takes you where you want to go, and 3 tips for what to do after the interview to make sure that it continues to give you the results and the outcome that you were expecting to begin with. So why don't we start with what to do to prepare? This goes before I even get to tips. You should know that you need to prepare, right? You should know that you should not just wing it. You should not just go and be like, I'm a pretty likable person. I'm a podcaster. It doesn't matter. I'm just going to show up. No, you're going to listen to some episodes on that podcast so that you know what they like to talk about. So you know what their style is, so that you are not surprised at the end of the interview when they tell you, this is a question we ask all of our guests. And you're like, tense up. I should have known this if I had just listened to one episode. So first of all, you're going to prepare. And I'm going to assume that you do because you're an awesome person. You're type A. You are ready for this opportunity. So do prepare. If they send you the questions in advance, prepare your answers. Think about what you would say. But that's it. That is the end of the prep work. How do we make sure when we're in the interview that this is going to go the distance for you? Let's start with advice number 1 of during the interview. I want you to be yourself. What does that mean? That sounds such an advice for like a middle schooler, right? Just be yourself. Most of the clients that I have gotten from podcast guesting is because they liked my vibe. That's it. They just liked hanging out with me and they wanted to go and follow me and see what else I was talking about. That's it. So don't just stick to answering questions in a real way, in a how would you say it? In a mechanical way. Like, don't just answer questions. This is not a Google form. This is not a ChatGPT prompt. We want to see your personality. So how do you do that? How do you loosen up a little bit? Well, I just told you you needed to prepare your answers, right? Don't memorize them. Don't memorize your answers to the questions. Just know what is it that you might say in that situation. In fact, keep some stories in your pocket so you can bring them up. Stories are extremely memorable. All right. So I want you to let your personality just go. Pretend that the host is one of your great friends and you're just having coffee at a coffee house near your house and they're just asking you questions. And you're like, listen, man, this is what we need to talk about. Listen, lady, this is what you need to know, right? I want you to loosen up and show me your real personality. Smile, joke about something that she talked about or that they talked about in a previous episode, right? Don't be stiff. So that's going to be number one. Even though you prepare your questions in advance, you are not going to recite them. You're not going to read them out from memory. You are going to loosen up. Number two, which I just mentioned a little bit, but I need to make it its own point. Bring stories. So beyond answering questions, bring a story. This is what makes your stuff memorable. Now, I'm going to give you a quick example. I was on the Yo Quiero Dinero podcast. It means I want money in Spanish. It's a huge podcast about personal finance. I don't talk about personal finance. I'm a business coach. I don't usually talk about finances. But when she asked me a question, like the very first question, hey, why don't you tell everybody what your approach is to personal finance? I didn't start by saying, well, thank you for your question. And my approach to personal finance is this. I started by answering, that is a great question. And I think it will make more sense once you understand a little bit of context. So I gave them a little bit of my story. I told them that, this was always my approach towards personal finance. And I realized that it really wasn't serving me. I ended up in a ton of debt and I had to dig myself out of it. I needed to realize that profits were king and I had to turn that around. So when I figured that out, this is what I end up doing from personal finance. And that's why it works for me. So if you are in debt right now, I recommend doing that. Right? So you need to give them a story. So right there, even though they gave me a very specific question to answer, I use story to illustrate the context, to tell them, to bring them in behind the scenes of why am I answering this? Why should you be listening to me? So keep those stories in your back pocket. And for every question that they ask you, if it's relevant, to tell a story that will make a bigger picture, that will illustrate what you want to say, and that's what you're going to be doing. Bring stories, keep them in your pocket. What if they don't give you the questions in advance? Even better, because that means that you can talk about whatever they want to talk about and inject more stories and really expand the scope on your own of that interview and give it much more color. And I promise you, hosts appreciate a colorful guest who doesn't just stick to facts. So bring stories. And the third tip of what to do during the interview is I want you to have a great call to action at the end that is going to bring people into your world. If you're a podcaster, tell them, hey, you're already on a podcasting app, go and subscribe to that podcast because that's my podcast and we talk a lot more about there. Right? If you are a business owner and you have a mailing list, give them a freebie that is relevant to what you were talking about. Hey, by the way, I have a little gift for your audience. It's completely free and they can get all of my subject lines for 2025. Go to this link. Thank you so much for sharing that, right? Bring a great call to action for people to follow you. If you're already a podcaster, definitely use that podcast. So let's go real quick. What do you do after the interview? This is the part that is just going to blow your mind because that host is probably going to promote the episode once. If you're lucky, maybe twice. If you're even luckier, they will send an email to their mailing list, but it's not guaranteed. So what are you going to do to promote? Knowing that they're the ones who have the bigger audience, right? If I go and I publish this episode or I promote this episode to my audience of 20 people, it's not going to create that big of a splash. I kind of want them to promote it to their audience, right? So what do? Number one, we are going to share about the episode. Absolutely. To your audience of 20, to your audience of 100, to your audience of 1,000, you are going to be sharing it. You're going to create your own reels. You're not going to wait for the host to send you videos to promote on your platform. You're going to do that yourself. You're going to go on the YouTube video and you're going to do a screen grab and you're going to create your own reels based on this. Tip number two. when you create those reels, you're not just going to tag them. You are going to add them as collaborators, and you're going to create a really good cover so that they won't be afraid to add that cover to their feed. That's really the biggest objection, is that most of these people who have made it to a certain level have a certain aesthetic, a certain feed aesthetic that they like to follow. So if your reel doesn't really match it, it's not going to be worth it to them to add it. However, if you're making them sound really good, right? If this episode makes them look amazing and the reel aesthetic matches or doesn't really disrupt their feed too much, they will reshare it, right? They will add it. You're going to be adding them as collaborator, and they're going to add it to their feed. One of my reels for one of my podcast episodes broke the 10,000 view mark. Then it broke the 20,000 view mark for a podcast episode. Yes, because my big audience guest decided to accept the collaboration request. So make sure that you're doing that. Let's go to point number 3. So point number 1 is you are going to share the episode even if it's your small audience. Number 2, you're going to add them as a collaborator and make sure that they sound really good in it, right? Make sure that the reel that you're creating is not just you talking and answering a question, making you look smart. Make sure that it shows the host asking an incredible question, something that really showcases their podcast, something they would want to share. And tip number 3, you're not just going to give up at that. You're going to bring back up that reel or create a new one that also makes them look amazing a month later, and then 2 months later, and then 3 months later. You're going to keep rehashing this interview and continuously doing it. And you're going to tag them in your stories so that they can reshare it on your stories in a really easy way that doesn't affect their feed, right? You are going to be doing that. And if they see that somebody's making them look really good, and it's somebody else that created the content, they didn't have to do anything. This is great social proof for that host. They will reshare it to your stories, giving you way more visibility and managing, finally, to elevate your authority, getting clients and getting more followers. I really hope that this was helpful. Let's recap real quick. You are going to make the most out of your podcast guesting, and you're going to steal their listeners by doing these things. You're going to prepare for the interview. Don't wing it. During the interview, number 1, you're going to be yourself and show your true personality. Number 2, you're going to come with stories and inject them wherever you can. And number 3, you're going to have a great call to action at the end. And after the interview, you're going to share it to your smaller audience. You are going to tag them as contributors to have the opportunity to show up on their feed. And number 3, you're going to bring that back around every single month and tag them on stories to give you more visibility, even way past the time that the interview was published. Thank you so much for listening to this, and I really hope that it was helpful.